I have always loved trying to draw and paint faces. Being able to paint a person onto paper feels like magic. Though portraits are one of the most fascinating subjects to paint, they are also one of the most difficult, especially when using acrylic paints. So grab your paints and join me on this journey in my sketchbook as we paint a portrait with acrylics. I chose to paint this portrait in my toned 5x8 inch sketchbook. I have really enjoyed using toned paper lately. It is wonderful because it counteracts some of the streaks that occur when using paints that are transparent. The toned paper will hide the streaks so that you do not have to paint as many layers on top to cover them up. Make sure you test your paint colors on the toned paper first, because the color can appear much different than it does on white paper. I started the first layer of my portrait using a beige acrylic craft paint from folk art called Linen Toile. When I first applied it onto the toned paper, I realized it appeared too white and would make the portrait look washed out, so I adjusted the color by mixing in some burnt sienna. I started the portrait by filling in some of the darkest areas with burnt umber, including the areas of the eye, ear, mouth, and nose. I then filled in my first layers with beige for the face, red for the lips, blue for the eyes, and brown for the hair. I let this layer dry completely. I have been learning how important it is to let your layers dry in between when painting with acrylics. I noticed that when a layer is not fully dried and you try to paint on top of it, it can cause the paint underneath to lift up, shift, and move. This can cause messy looking results. Next, I took my beige mixture and shifted it darker by adding some burnt sienna to create a warm shadow color. This is another tricky thing about painting with acrylics. After I mixed the color and started to apply it on the top of the first layer, it seemed to be the correct value, but as I continued to paint, it began to dry darker. My shadows began to appear too harsh, and I did not have the soft blended look that I was looking for. This is another thing to keep in mind when painting with acrylic. When mixing your paints, try to mix them slightly lighter than the actual color that you want. When you first put your paint onto the page, it may appear too light, but keep painting and see how it will magically dry darker. This is something that simply takes practice and getting used to. I then added some burnt umber into my shadow mixture to make a cooler shadow color. If you don't have burnt umber paint, I recommend adding it to your palette. For me, it has turned out to be one of the most used and versatile colors I own. I continue to add shadows throughout the portrait, adding more to the face as well as the hair and lips. I then tried to smooth out some of the shadows on the face with my original beige color as I noticed my shadows were too harsh. Because the original beige color that I was going to use had a lot of white in it, I realized that it would make a great light value color to place in some highlights and to build up form. I then darkened the hair with some burnt umber, leaving it less detailed because I wanted the face to remain as a focal point. I then used titanium white to put in the final highlights and details. Overall, I'm happy with how the portrait turned out. With every painting, I learned something new and better understand the challenges of painting and how to correct them. Please stick around and join me along this journey to master acrylic painting. Let's see how much we can improve.